bright horizons. My name is Mora, and I am an author and illustrator. And as I tell kids often, essentially what that means is I get to spend my days drawing and writing stories. And maybe you've heard of some of my stories. I have a book called Thank You, Amu that I wrote and illustrated. I have another book called Saturday that I wrote and illustrated. I have a book called The Oldest Student, How Mary Walker Learned to Read, which was written by the fabulous Rita Lorraine Hubbard. And of course, I have my most recent book. And I'm like, where do I place everything in my studio? I'm like, I'm running out of table space. I have my most recent book that came out that is called Everybody in the Red Brick Building, which was written by the fabulous Ann Winter and was illustrated by, well, me. I'm so excited to maybe at least get a chance to digitally be in your homes, your classrooms, or wherever you are out there. And I'd love to tell you a little bit more about me and my work, like why collage? And there's so many different reasons for that. I think growing up, there was this really amazing artist, Samina Robinson, who made work at my community, and she did these gigantic murals that were all around my neighborhood. And not only did she do these really beautiful gigantic murals that told the story of my neighborhood through these murals, she also made these gigantic quilts that I got an opportunity to see in person at the museum. And when you look at these quilts, she has old buttons. She has like a faded pair of jeans or a piece of clothing here and there. And I was just really fascinated by the different materials that she would use, because I thought there was just something really amazing about how she could take these ordinary materials. I'm like, I'm sure I have a pair of jeans I don't wear anymore in my closet right now, or these like buttons, you know, that you can sometimes accumulate. And she could take these things that so many of us might consider things that we need to donate or throw away, or the things that they're the junk. And she was able to make something incredibly beautiful out of them. And I think that's the thing that really inspires me as a collage artist, and really just inspires me as a person. And what are the things that we're overlooking, whether they are a scrap of paper here or there, but like what are maybe the things, the moments that might feel small or insignificant, but when we really, really look at them, are what the life is really all about. And I just love the opportunity as a collage artist to maybe celebrate the idea of how there are things that we are overlooking in our lives that when we bring front and center, remind us that this is what life is all about. I think that that's kind of the symbolism of using all these scraps here and there that I find in my work. And so I'd like to talk about lots of the papers that I use. What's kind of interesting about when I look at my book, Everybody in the Red Brick Building, is it's kind of like a scrapbook, you know? I made this book during the pandemic. I was making all the collage artwork in this book. And it was interesting kind of really illustrate this community that we see here, this home that we see depicted in this apartment building, and being far away from mine, you know, like so many people in the pandemic, I was separated from my family, and I was really close to my family, and I couldn't see my friends like I used to see them constantly. And so there was just a certain degree of isolation that comes with that experience. And as isolating and lonely as that can feel sometimes when we're in those situations, definitely I felt the feeling of loneliness during the pandemic. Working on artwork, being able to cut up these pieces and things that I have here and there, and really creating comforting, warm images that remind us of family, that remind us of community, that remind us of the power of that home, that welcoming space that we have in our lives, was something that was really comforting to me. And so when I look at this book, on one hand, I can see it as a time where it was difficult and a harder time, and where things were chaotic. We didn't know what was going on. But I also just see all these different papers, and it's like a scrapbook where I can think about where I got this paper from and who gave me this paper or making that paper and things like that. That's something that's special when I look at my books. It's kind of like a scrapbook of this particular time of my life and the things that are special to me. Those are the things that I like to use to create the pages within my books. And so speaking of the papers that are given to me. So as you might not have noticed, I'm very fond of paper. I probably spent the last 2 or 3 minutes talking about it. But not, since a lot of people and a lot of friends and people that I run into know that I'm really fond of paper, I usually have to go out and search and find or maybe create my own papers. But these days, a lot of people give me some. And so I'm always fond of the papers that people send along my way. And it was fun using those papers in this particular book. So for example, a page that I love in this particular book is this page of this little girl who's with her younger sister, and she's showing her all the different planets and constellations in space. They're just having this really great sister bonding sort of moment. Well, whenever I look at this particular page, I'm always interested by this little planet that you see really hard at the bottom. And it's a little hard to see it, you know, when because this is like the photo reproduction of it. But that little planet is made from a paper that I have over here. And this paper was actually a gift from me from a librarian. It was actually a librarian on the Caldecott committee the year I won an honor for Thank You Amu. And afterwards, she sent me a beautiful letter, and she gave me some scraps of, it's not even exactly paper. It almost feels like a leather or some sort of like fabric or of some sort, but it feels kind of leathery to me, but it's not actually truly paper. And she uses this to make these really beautiful, beautiful earrings that she has on Etsy. And so she gave me some of the scraps that she thought I might like that she had used already to make earrings. And so you can see here where she cut that earring out and the scrap that's outside of it. And it's just such a dear, dear gift to me. I held on to these particular papers for a while until you kind of find the right moment for them. And so I was just really glad to get an opportunity to use this particular paper in this book. And so every time I even look at the actual artwork itself, I always find myself just rubbing my hands over this particular spot and just remembering that this was a special gift that someone gave specifically to me. And I just think of the warmth of that gift and things like that. And it's just a special piece of paper for a special book. Speaking of other gifts that were given to me, this paper, and you can see where I've cut out from it, is actually a paper, I guess, from a particular cake. I had got like a cake shop of some sort. So I had gone to a school visit back when we were doing in-person school visits before the pandemic. And I had done a school visit over there, and they were like, hey, we know we coming here that you really love paper. And there's this cake bakery that's really popular around where we're at. And we looked at the paper that we get from the cake, and we just thought you would love it. And so they were like, so we kept this paper so that we could give it to you. And I was very touched by this gift, and I took the paper, and I loved this paper, and I had an eye to use it for this particular book. The Rock Wake Up page. Originally, I had cut out this paper to go right here. Now, the thing I noticed was, even though this paper here is like super, super bright, it somehow wasn't bright enough or like fit into the color palette perfectly. And so I basically had to paint my own paper and make it look like this paper as much as possible. And that's actually the paper that I ended up using for this speech bubble right here. But essentially, this was just my recreation of this paper that I have here, because I had cut it out and it was just a little too dark. It needed to be just a little bit brighter to work. But even still, even though I didn't end up using this exact paper for this particular page, I had this paper in mind. I had this material in mind when I was painting this particular page. And I just think that that's really cool now that people will gift me things, and those become things that I have an opportunity to use to make special pieces of artwork. And so, yeah, like whenever I look at any of these pages, there's usually some sort of story behind it or some moment or thing that reminds me. Like, for example, I'll do one more of some of my particular papers. So there's a little girl in this book. Her name is Izzy. And Izzy wears a little head wrap on her head, a little bow Izzy has. And that bow that you see is actually this paper that you see right here. And then here's another pattern, which isn't the same pattern. It's actually a larger version and the reverse of this pattern you see here. And that's the paper that I use for Izzy's mother. And that's what you're seeing here, as you can see the reverse of that pattern that the mom is using for her head wrap. And so I thought it was kind of cool that they were kind of united by this pattern. But the reason why this is a pattern or a drawing that I created myself. And the reason I even have this pattern is it was a pattern that I designed for my sister's wedding. And so I kept that pattern around. It was a colorway that I didn't end up going with. And that became the pattern that I used for baby Izzy and the mom that you see in this particular book. And so again, whenever I hold this paper, I think of my sister's special day and all the love and care that went into this, designing this pattern for that day and celebrating all of that. But I think that's the thing I think is just so amazing about collage, is I always tell people, what people say, like, what is collage to you? And I always say that collage is a conversation. You talk to the work and the work talks back to you. And I think sometimes people will say like, oh, you're a master of collage, or you're like a collage expert. And I think it sounds very funny to call anyone a collage expert, you know, because I think that's what I like about the medium, is that you can put all the intention you desire. Don't worry, I come in with plans, but the medium, it finds its way to humble you every single time. And you don't just master it, you don't just figure it out. I just think over time you get comfortable with the idea of surrender, with the thought of not knowing, and with the fact that sometimes you're going to have to trust the process. And so I think there's just something really beautiful, at least for me, of I come into the studio every day and I'm reminded of that fact. And I'm reminded of just leaving room for the medium to surprise me. You know, just like I'm surprised and dazzled by so many people in my life, and really having opportunities to share that with the world. It's funny talking about all this and how much collage has really become my approach to life. You know, I think the way that I approach the page is how I like to approach my life in that regard, of just leaving moments and leaving space for life to surprise me as well. But it's also interesting thinking back about how, when I was making this particular book, with everything that was going on that particular summer with the pandemic and everything, there were plenty of times when I felt helpless, you know, and there was a lot of stuff going on. There were a lot of people hurting, and I was hurting, and I just didn't really know what to do. And what I was doing, making books for kids, in some ways it felt really, really small, you know? And so I had those days where I just didn't collage. I stayed in bed all day. I just didn't really know what I was doing. But, you know, I couldn't do that forever. And so I got out of bed and I went to my desk and I took out a snip of paper here and some paint here, and I began to cut things. And I began to arrange things and to put these images together, because I knew in that process I needed to put myself together, because it was through that process of making artwork, of making these pages within this book, that I was reminded of how much children need stories. And that process of realizing how much I needed that story, and working on this book and making these children and the families that you see here, I was reminded of how much kids would need these stories as well.